Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you today. And you asked me what I think about the crisis and how the transport sector will be impacted by the crisis. I was asked to speak on this topic for 20 minutes. So basically, it's going to be a very broad brush picture in a nutshell. If you doubt that there is any link between transport and crisis, well, you probably have read the newspaper. I mean, General Motors this morning, etc., and the newspaper headlines, so there are very specific impacts here. You all know that transportation is one of the aspects where economic progress has made itself most palpable, and the same applies to the maritime sector. But there are also other issues which we need to look at. Now, transport is a growth factor, but it also has a curbing impact, and it will have a strong impact on the environment. The transport sector is going to become the bogeyman for all kinds of economic changes. Now, you asked me to make a statement and give you my views on this. Of course, everybody will have their own views on the crisis, the duration of the prospective duration of the crisis. Well, I'm one of the more pessimist augurs, and I think that the crisis is just at its very beginning. The crisis has various mechanisms. These mechanisms take place at 3 different levels, and these mechanisms are also manifest at various points. Let's take the United States. In the United States, we have a middle class which was more or less stable, stagnant in the 1980s. And instead of compensating this by, for instance, either raising payroll or increasing the revenue level or the remuneration levels. Instead, the government decided to steer the banking sector and provide subsidies to the banking sector. And within this banking sector, the automotive industry was very important in the United States because people took out loans to buy cars and to buy homes. And, of course, there was an excessive growth in lending, and this there was a spillover effect of these bad loans, which impacted the entire world. This was the first mechanism. But I said there were 3 mechanisms, and now let's talk about the second mechanism. Banks joined forces and they created loan pools. However, the risk was understated. Revenue and profit was extreme. Everybody was in the game. Everybody was benefiting from this. I mean, even those people who were the lobbyists for the poorest of the poor benefited from this. And, of course, this is a contradiction on the market, and there was a regulation which was absent here at the local level. We in Europe know this. We created a common market within 30 years, but we also know that there's no such thing as a single market without a single regulation. We also have the Economic Monetary Union, and the same has to take place across the entire globe. We need to have a single market across the globe and a single regulation. We do not only need the legal texts, but we also need to enforce them and need to make sure that there's compliance. And this is basically at the root cause of this crisis. Let's take a look at history, more or less. This crisis is nothing but the expression of the fatigue of the Occident. of the Western world, and an American historian once dubbed or saw a dichotomy between the old and the new Europe. But I think there's an old West, old Occident, and the United States forms part of this old West. There are three factors: the population, capital, and technological progress here in this old Occident. For the past two centuries, this progress is backed by the nations which form part of the quote-unquote old Occident, but the population which came from the new Occident, the migration created this growth, and there are no longer savings deposits in the United States. Of course, this does exist in other countries, does still exist in other countries, but in view of the major financial innovations which came and in view of the major remittances, the funding which came brought a lot of attraction to the universities and then to the research sectors. And if you look at this on a historical timescale, you may quickly come to the conclusion that the Occident was a magnet for these forces. It was a magnet for capital, for equity, and it drew in everything, all the resources where there was a scarcity in the old Occident. It was an artificial growth which was maintained artificially. 5 billion or 8 billion, of course, have a huge impact. The Chinese did precisely the same. They followed the same development trajectory. Chinese scientists went to Europe, went to the United States, and now they go back home. So China makes sure that the brain drain is compensated, is reversed again, that people go back to the roots, go to the country of origin. And I think it is the fatigue of the Occident which is the driving force behind this crisis. As a result of the high debt ratio, as the result of the high leverage, this crisis is maintained artificially. Now, of course, I would hope that this was the end of the crisis, but I mean, if everybody all of those who think that this is the end of the crisis, hope that this is true or think that it is true, and I, of course, hope that this is true. But what is the scenario which I'm about to paint here? Question to you: has the crisis reached its end? Question. We've seen a major downturn, minus 60 to 70% in economic growth in some sectors. The financial sector, however, has undergone restructuring. The stock exchange prices are rising again. Some countries, like China, see growth rates again. What we call the green shoot or green leaves appear again on the trees. There's a silver lining on the horizon. Billions and billions have been spent. Banks can return to offer liquidity. People can take out loans again, and there is a certain dynamism, an economic dynamism, which is taking place again and which is showing itself again. I would really hope that this recovery was here to stay, and the American system is truly the mainstay of this entire organization. And I do hope that this recovery is here to stay, of course. But what about the cash flow of banks? Is that sustainable? What about banking solvency? What about the budgets of the major countries or the major nation states? And the liquidity and cash flow, if there's no solvency of banks, then this recovery will not be sustainable. The low lending rates will not be sustainable, and solvency of the banks is not back in the green. $93 trillion are in circulation, and this money is tied up or wrapped up in toxic waste. Of course, there's a relaunch. I mean, these bad products are being weeded out, But on the other hand, it's not the end of the day yet, so people still have more homework to do before confidence in the banks and their solvency is restored. Growth is very sluggish. Sometimes there's also zero growth. And there will still be a couple of encumbrances for solvencies. The people who are affected by this are not only the middle class, but also the real estate agents, the agencies, the credit rating agencies. Everybody talks about economic lending and the domino effect, which we have seen with regard to the banking sector in the US. Of course, we all live in integrated economic systems, and this means that this will not only impact the local market. I do hope that the system holds true and that there will not be any successive spillover effects where bad banks will proliferate, because I think this is very dangerous. Or nationalization. And what we are about to do nowadays for General Motors could in the future also be proposed for other systems. My second question, which I would like to posit here, is what about the credibility of money and budgets? The global deficit is currently exploding. There's excessive debt everywhere. Everybody knows that the crisis can only be overcome if we cut back our debts. What have we been doing for the past 1.5 years? Well, debt is on the increase, and I think this will deteriorate the crisis in the long term. Let's briefly talk about the American economy. During the global economic crisis, our debt ratio was 205 times the GDP, and now we are at the ratio of 305 times the GDP. That is the US. And all players have on aggregate have 500 times the GDP debt ratio, and the global GDP is also affected by this, obviously. 11 to 13 trillion dollars debt. That's what we're talking about. And the global financial system has actually already maybe given in. And it won't be able to compensate and extricate from itself from this crisis. Of course, we may assume that China will adopt a different approach here. In the past, people kept talking about billions of dollars, and now the order of magnitude has shifted to trillions. The currency reserves in China are $2 trillion, and that's about the deficit which is accrued in the US over 1 year. The new administration in the US declares that they plan to overcome the deficit. So at the moment, there are a lot of question marks which abound. And it is not entirely clear whether we will be able to extricate ourselves from this crisis, or whether, due to the sheer magnitude of the crisis, we won't be able to overcome the crisis at all anymore. Well, basically, we can see 3 scenarios here. First of all, we may assume that there's a deepening of the crisis, that we will be plunged even deeper into a recession, that the global economy will remain in the doldrums, 0% growth in the US, and maybe next year we'll also have zero growth in Europe, or even negative growth. And we may take it that these problems will see a further exacerbation unless we will be able to extricate ourselves from this predicament. Or maybe we generate another bubble, a collective bubble. That's the only thing which we can do, the only remedy which we can adopt here. Another high debt of the various nation states, or the US, Europe, Asia, Japan. Of course, you can borrow, you can live on borrowing, you can also lead an excellent life. Japan has been living a life with debts for a long time. And the US is the biggest power in the world, and everybody pretends as if despite this huge deficit, the dollar was still the haven of stability. Or, and that's the third scenario, we may see another growth period with a high savings rate, high degree of deposits, savings deposits, always assuming that we have high growth rates again, but there we will see a lot of volatility and blips. We've known these blips for many decades. We are the decision makers. We've seen these blips in the past. I mean, we're decision makers, we're policy makers, and we may say, well, we'll just wait for the bubble to unfold, etc. But sooner or later, the bubble is going to backfire. And, of course, you can say, well, okay, that's life. I mean, after the recession, you'll see an inflation. But now I'm going to use a word. Well, one of the major historical scholars was here in this city. And in one of the darkest chapters of German history, we had one of the most courageous advocates here in Leipzig, who was living here in Leipzig. And he said back then, nowadays we are threatened by an evolution towards Weimar, a planetary Weimar, evolution and inflation. And I mean, everybody who's German here in the audience will know what I mean when I use the buzzword Weimar. Weimar was a genuine tragedy, and it was followed by the darkest chapters of German history. I mean, that's the truth. I mean, we may turn a blind eye to this, and we could pretend as though we had the funds and the means to do more borrowing, and as though we may kid ourselves and think this is sustainable, but this is not true. I mean, we Europeans have our own history, and we learned our lesson from history. We understand that we need to wake up to the truth, and we need to economize. And we must not just bank on the deposits in other people's bank accounts. We must compensate our budgets, or we must set rules and regulations so as to overcome our budget deficit and reduce the budget deficit. We all know that taxes have almost become a dirty word in many countries, but we've got no choice. We need to use taxes to offset this disbalance. Last but not least, the resolution is regulation, better international prudential supervision. I'm not saying more regulation, I'm saying better regulation. We've got regulation in place, but the thing is it was never applied. We do have rules and regulations. We have the Basel Capital Accord, and Basel was not applied accordingly. Banks, for instance. Basel II, solvency, was regulated under Basel. Basel said that the debt ratio must not exceed the factor of 12 of the deposits in your bank, and these rules were not complied with. And that means that the rules are not a problem, but compliance is a problem. How can we improve compliance? Very often in the past, we just paid lip service. We never really walked the talk. We just adopted regulations, but there was a lack of monitoring. So accountability was an issue. We promulgated various rules and regulations, but monitoring and follow-up was really an issue. Compliance. This growth will see a completely new dimension, and once we have weathered the storm, once we have come out of this bubble, and once we see the emergence of another bubble, and that's a bubble where we don't know what's in the future. I mean, for instance, what about climate change? All of this is going to be very uncertain. But if the new bubble is going to materialize in an unregulated market, then we will just be completely derailed. Climate, for instance, is something that we can't really control. And we do know that we needed to do that we've been doing, or there was a need to do homework quite some time ago. But basically, we can really learn the lesson from the financial crisis. We need to get a grip on this monster, and we need to take action now. We need rules and regulations. Otherwise, we won't have learned any lesson from the financial crisis. And in the field of the economic problems, the whole story is just going to repeat itself again. History is going to repeat itself again unless we learn the lessons. Now, in the economic stimulus packages, we've always said, well, we've already learned our lesson. We've got more motorways to construct, and we can provide subsidies to the automotive industry, etc. And in the past, we did this, that, or the other, and that's what worked in order to provide a stimulus to the economy. But actually, this is the worst we could do. Trying to repeat the old recipes, trying to repeat the old mistakes, and hoping that things will improve. I mean, you've got an excellent building site in front of you, but of course transportation is important, but the modes of transport need to be completely revised. They need to be compatible with our new environmental rules and regulations. You have an excellent task ahead of you, and I trust you to weather this storm, and I trust that this crisis will very soon only be a bad memory.
Thank you very, very much. Very interesting to hear your thoughts. In your last book, The Brief History of the Future, you talked about, and of course it was written before the crisis, about the development of globalization into something which you referred to as nomadization, a sort of hyper-globalization. How would you revise that prognosis in light of the crisis? Do you think we'll see something that people are now calling reverse globalization? This affects many people in the room who are worried about reconfiguration of supply lines, protectionism, a rollback, essentially, of globalization.
Well, you're kind enough to remember this book, which is now just been published in English. And in this book, I forecast the crisis. I thought the crisis will happen later. That means that very often we are wrong, not in predicting, but in predicting the timing of events. Either we will accept to jump into a global governance, if not a global government, but at least a global governance. And the G20 is just the beginning of that. Or we'll suddenly go back to protectionism. Nationalization is a first step towards protectionism. And nomadism is another name of market economy, because market economy means that merchants can move, companies can move, products will move. Either we'll accept to organize global nomadism, or we'll go to a catastrophe. It's why it's so important to solve the question of budget deficit and trust into currencies. It's why it's so important to jump to what the Chinese government has proposed, which is to think about something like a global currency. We in Europe, we know that we could not have a global market and have circulation of goods without a common currency, without a single currency, because exchange rates is one of the devices that can lead to protectionism. And then either we will be able in the next 20 years to have a dream of a global currency or global governance, or protectionism will be back.
Thank you very, very much.